Welcome, everybody, as we seem to be beginning summer in earnest now. So we'll begin with a sit, and I'm going to guide this practice in a way that seems more important. Every year, it just seems more important to get grounded in the body, and then to drop this center of gravity. We're so much up, and getting even more so, spending so much time on screens. Um, and it's just not that healthy. We need to drop down also for really getting traction on the path. We're going to have to tune into, warm up to, and befriend all those itchy, squirrely, edgy things that are inside. And it seems like those really, the worst of them, the most difficult, our biggest vulnerabilities, lodge in the belly. So we want to move from the head, the throat, and even the heart to some extent, into the hara, or into the belly. So that's on this kind of a new practice. So I'll present it, or we'll do it now. So of course, as you already are, letting yourself settle into your seat. Your attention into your breathing and feeling the fullness of your breath from the top of the lungs to the bottom, down into the pelvis. Breathing through the whole body, letting yourself be completely filled and completely emptied. And in beginning, let's emphasize the exhale from the belly. Exhaling, letting go. Breath will come in on its own. But then really letting what's in there release, loosen, and lift. Three or four finger widths from the navel, down there, in the pelvis, in the deep belly. Letting go. Emphasizing the emptying from the belly, releasing. Tuning into the sensations of the breath. Right now, primarily in that belly. Also, tuning in to the subtle body, the felt sense, and especially how it's lodged or current in the gut. However it is you may be holding in there, tuning in to the density, tuning into whatever tension might be there. Exhale, release. letting yourself go deep and down. Exhale, letting go. Tuning into however it is you've been managing yourself, keeping yourself together. However that feels to you. Exhale, loosen, lighten, let go. Letting the belly soften. Letting your tensions go. Finding your center right there below the navel, in the emotional center of your body. Emphasizing the exhale still. Just this. Allowing yourself release. Befriending whatever vulnerability. Letting go. Exhaling all the way to empty. All the way to open. in this intimacy with yourself, safe space, holding nothing back from you, letting it go. And letting yourself settle. Now letting your breath be balanced, emphasizing both the exhale and the inhale. Breathing in, feeling in, tuning in, exhaling, letting it all go. Inhabiting your breath as your breath inhabits your body. Breathing through the whole body, inhabiting the sensations of the body from head to toe. Opening your full sentience, physical sensations, also felt sensing, letting yourself be fully sentient, letting go of having to be in control and giving yourself over to the larger rhythm, letting yourself be breathed, surrendering to the breath, surrendering to what is the physical body and the subtle body of felt sensing, emotional tone. Letting the system settle into itself. thoughts arise, let them arise. Also let them go. Letting your defenses relax. Just this, just breathing. Inhabiting the vitality of sentient awareness. Simplicity, bare attention, uncomplicated, moment to moment, belly grounded, the stable yet flowing. Feel how it's both happening. Settledness, earthy, and yet sensations, feelings, thoughts, all flowing. Equanimity. So there's a sense of privacy with the eyes closed. Maybe it feels a little protected. I mean, at the same time, in this grounded space, allowing your sense doors to be open. They mostly are already. Also, let your eyes gently open. Just very softly in front of you, maybe a couple feet in front of you, without focusing on anything. Being aware of color and form, letting yourself see and be seen. In yourself be visible. These doors of the soul, as is said, the eyes. Yeah, belly in the center, there in the hara. Just soften, wide, so you're seeing also your peripheral vision, not just a point, open in some sense to the whole room. Soft eyes. Just at some point seen in your belly. Soft belly. In yourself, be the being you are without apology or embarrassment. Just so. Breathe into this, seeing and the courage to be seen, not hiding. Eyes open, heart open, belly open. Whole sentence. Notice the eyes can see in front to the sides. Your awareness also goes around to the back. Your psychic sense, the field of your awareness is spherical, 360. Breathing in and through the wholeness. Breathing in to the gentleness, the kindness of letting yourself in these moments be fully as you are, upright, grounded, dignified, undefended. And I tune into the wholeness of that, the spaciousness of your awareness, multidimensional senses, feelings, thoughts, and boundless, the awareness. Rooting yourself in the boundlessness of your presence. Open-ended. In the body, 100% belly-based. Yet the awareness extends beyond the edges of the body. Totally free, unconditioned. Tuning into this groundedness, this larger sense of being rooted in being as such, presence as such, pervasive awareness. From self-centered to presence-centered. So if you'd like to take a little stretch, or you need a bathroom break, we're going to have 2 or 3 minutes. Okay. So now we're going to think a bit. Um, but in some sense, sitting together is the best part. But this is also kind of important. Tonight we want to talk about right view, which is the first, it's the foundation of the Eightfold Path. So right away, we we know that the Eightfold is, I suppose you do know, there's eight right things: right view, right intention, right speech, and so on. And so normally we think of these, we think of right as opposed to wrong. And that does kind of work, but it really, right is really more in the sense of right on. Going to do right on view rather than dull, distorted, not quite with it view. Sometimes this gets translated as wise. And I think I noticed also particularly in recovery Dharma, that's how it's done. And I think there's a good idea, this is a good idea, particularly for those of us that are prone to self-judgment. So there's a way that we can soften this for us so we don't get sucked into this either or thing. We could be the right thing or the wrong thing. Here, foundation, it's particularly important because these first points, like the root, if we can get our view clarified, then all the other eightfold, the other seven folds just fall into place. Similarly, if you're aware of the um, links of dependent origination, that first link, often translated as ignorance, more literally means unawareness, lack of presence. That's the linchpin. So if we can cut the root, then the other 12 just evaporate. So it's particularly, I think it's particularly valuable to spend time just at the beginning. So when we speak about view or understanding, right understanding sometimes, or right view, we're talking about distinguishing between pure and impure vision. Distorted, confused, ignorant, um, clouded. We want to clarify our vision into its natural wakefulness. We want to clarify the veil through which we see things, our projections and introjections, into what they really are, our perceptions for what they really are, rather than what we think they are. So that's what's at stake. We talk about right view. But before we go more into view, let's spend a moment with this right, because it's really beautiful. The Sanskrit is samyak, or in Pali sama, and that gets translated as right or wise. What samyak means is perfect, total, complete, unmediated, not mediated through our interpretations, through our opinions, through our emotional reactions and mental constructs. And so, as John Travis likes to repeat, this Buddha uh, quote of, in the seeing, there's just the seeing, in the hearing, just the hearing, tasting, just the tasting. There's no narrative involved. Just that is freedom, the awakened state. Samyak, perfect, as it is, perfect in that sense, as it is, rather than as we construe it in our biases and so forth. So we want to distinguish between reality as it is and then our narrating, our commentary, the mediation of us between us and what is. And this process of path, this is the path. We want to, in one sense, cultivate right view. So there's the question of how do we do that? But we can also understand right view as it is. So it's said, I don't believe it's said in the Theravada, but certainly in the Vajrayana, and I think in the Mahayana too. There's a distinction made between provisional teaching, the provisional path, and the definitive teaching, which is linked to the difference between relative truth and essential or absolute truth. This comes out in the Mahayana, the notion that there's two truths. And the major difference between these two kinds of approaches, provisional and definitive, relative and essential, is that one clarifies vision bit by bit, gradually, and the other, an instantaneous recognition of our wakeful clarity all at once. Is how vision is undistorted, naked presence. It's either clothed or unclothed. It can be partially clothed, but then it's still clothed. So this is really the difference between relative and absolute, between visional and definitive, bit by bit versus just now, here and now. Which is, of course, from a relative point of view, where we want to get to. We want to go from where we are in confusion, projections, what we think about what's out there, and then likewise our introjections, the opinions we have about ourselves. These opinions that often I would really feel I could say always take in when we're really little, when we really have no discriminative capacity to choose yes or no. We take in a certain kind of a stance in relation to our environment, which is probably not enlightened. And so we adapt and find ourselves within that twist, that conditioned reality. And so in terms of view, way that we encounter it from our everyday perspective, within our dualistic vision, where we're convinced that I am separate from you. Subject is separate from the object, from the world. It just feels like that seems how it is. And what the Buddha and other seers have pointed out, it's not how it is. It's how we're seeing it from our self-centered perspective. And of course, the self is centered within a world, a culture, family, there's primary relationships of parents, siblings, and subculture, perhaps our ethnicity, and then the larger culture we're in. All of these are conditional, arbitrary. They don't exist absolutely. And as we identify with those things and we put ourselves into our separate self box, and so encountering the world, it's not just like bad stuff. It's just, it goes with the territory of consciousness itself. Consciousness is always consciousness of. So we have this separation, which is a liability, but it's also a huge advantage because we suffer in a way that other mammals, for instance, don't suffer. We have neuroses. Most animals don't have that unless they've been domesticated. And then they can be neurotic. So this is just kind of FYI. So our situation as we come to it is something appears and we freeze it into an object. And as we freeze that, we simultaneously freeze this. The subject and the object are frozen. The object, it's something, this or that, not both. And on that basis, we have a feeling about it. We like it or dislike it. And as the affinity group we've been studying is for a while here, the how the mind operates, how the self-illusion comes to be, that it's not just one thing. We have perceptions through our sense organs, but we also have feelings. We also, on top of that, we have then emotional fleshings out. And on top of that, then we have the mental formations, the various repressions that can be peculiar to us, but also shared if we're part of a family or a culture, for instance. Also, there's similarities in terms of what sex we are. There's various views, feminine views, masculine views that kind of a kind. So we freeze ourself as well as freezing the object. And that's not all. Normal perception, it doesn't recognize what it's doing, also freezes the space between subject and object. So we find ourselves living in what feels to be a very solid world, very frozen. Space between being frozen impairs our ability to play with what appears, impairs our ability to dance. And so the question with view is, how do we see things in a less frozen way? How to do it? So the Dharma has these two ways within dualistic vision and not in dualistic vision. So within dualistic vision, in Buddha Dharma, for instance, there's various pointing out instructions, various supports to have us look into what's going on. And the matter of looking into what's going on is the radical shift. It's true for the Dharma, it's true for any spiritual path of true integrity. That we move from looking out, maybe with wearing glasses, or if we want to look closer, a microscope or a telescope, and instead we turn it around and we look at through the mirror. This is the path. You don't look out, you look in. And so foundational practice in Buddha Dharma involves both calming down, monkey mind down, settling down. In this exercise that we did today, the first part of the belly, this is all part of the shamatha. Calming, settling, not chasing after thoughts like we're usually doing. And on that basis, then inquiring into what's going on. How is the mind operating? This is the vipassana. This is the basic vipassana. And so we look into various things. We can look into how the aggregates are operating. We feel like there's a self, but when we look closely into how the self is operating, we see what's going on are feelings, and emotions, and thoughts, and we get triggered by something. And so the wisdom of the aggregates of this no self psychology, as we look in and what we see are these different constituents or aggregates. There isn't a self behind them. It's just the live experiencing of things. So as we're appreciating more deeply in that affinity group, that it's not enough to have an insight into no self. We can be sitting and we can look into it. What do we find? We don't. Didn't find it. We run the experiment again. Where is that self? Hard to find. Not there. Okay, I get it intellectually, but I don't get it in here. Because the selfing process is more than thinking. It also involves feeling. It also involves emotions. It also involves these tacit formations, which we can talk about as repressions, repressive barriers, things that have been too hot to handle. We've had to just put them out of our mind in order to adapt and get on with our life. They saved our bacon. Really, our ability to repress things is usually like a bad thing. No, no, no. It's a skillful thing. However, it outlives its usefulness because we grow up. We're not in that situation anymore. But the coping strategy that we developed didn't go away. And so our partner can say, why didn't you take out the recycling before the pickup came? And immediately have a reaction. Me, my fault, wait. And maybe we get angry. It was your turn to do it. Right? These things happen, these everyday sort of things happen because something gets us from behind. So the pointing out instructions of like how the mind works is skillful. also looking into things like suffering and the cause. We can look into that, or impermanence. We think things are lasting. Is that true? We think we're going to last. Is that true? Looking into getting impermanence. And then, of course, this issue of the solid self. Is that true? We can look into those things. We can look into the 12 links of dependent origination and realize how everything is in this, on this wheel, how samsara works. So when we're talking about clarifying our vision from being clouded and distorted to being clear and true, this basic way of working with our predicament within our dualistic vision, we point out how samsara works. Basically, the entirety of the Abhidharma focuses on this. How does the mind work? Which is to say, how does samsara work? And we learn it works through our objectivizing vision, reason, solidifying, rather than playing, being lighter, less harmed ourselves and others, more fluid is better. So the approach is we want to stop doing the things that harden us, these negative mind states, aggression, infatuation, jealousy, arrogance. There's a states, negative states, which we want to abandon, not do those things, because those things only make us tighter and create more suffering for us sooner or later. Karma has consequences. So we don't want to engage in karmic thoughts, negative speech, or negative actions. By the same token, we want to cultivate positive thoughts, speech, and action in order to loosen things up. Because when we're being kind, compassionate, practicing equanimity, practicing mindfulness, we're loosening that tightness, more conducive, we're creating a conducive environment for ourselves to see clearer. So now, why didn't you take out the recycling? Well, is it my turn? I thought it was your turn. No, it was your turn, and you didn't do it. Oh, I guess I'm imperfect. I guess I'm fallible. My fault. Okay, sorry. Right? If you do that, what happens to the potential argument? Oof, doesn't happen, does it? So we abandon the negative thoughts, actions, speech. We cultivate the positive actions, speech, and thoughts. We're in our dualistic vision. There's things to be rejected and things to be accepted. I'm trying to get somewhere, fellas. Trying to get from samsara to nirvana. Right? We're talking about the Eightfold Path. So this is fourth of the Noble Truths, right? Suffering, its cause, the end of suffering, then the path to get to the end of suffering. I don't know if it occurred to you in this lineup, that is a little slippery there at the end. Like it's a very nice progression, cause, suffering, yeah, okay. Then the cause of suffering, okay. And then the end. And then that's the goal, that's the fruit. And then how to get to the end is after the end. So in a linear way, it should come before, right? You do the path before you get to the goal. So I've been dwelling with this. I've been thinking about this. And I think it's not a mistake. It's not a mistake the way this happens. Um, because it works for both a progressive path, visional, relative truth within dualistic vision, and it also works in a moment, clear presence, wakeful, Bodhi mind. There's a difference. So now we're shifting to absolute. There's a difference because beforehand we're in confusion and dualistic vision. Afterwards, we're not. But the Eightfold Path works in both cases. The critical difference is that on the front end, when we're in our mess, in our fixations, in our emotional confusions, there's something to be done. So all these pointing out instructions and these meditation foci are all something to do because we're going somewhere. And so we can say that all of these practices taken together accord to something like what my heart teacher, Namkhai Norbu, referred to. And I don't think it was his idea. I think he learned this in Tibet as the path of renunciation. So what we call Theravada, but also this is true for Mahayana too. Those of us, if you've studied the Lojong teachings, the mind training teachings, of which Tonglen is involved, there's a lot of do's and don'ts in that as well. It's all part of the same path of renunciation. Renouncing one thing, cultivating the other thing. So gradually we want to do that. We want to clarify or purify our vision. And the same dynamic even continues into the Tantras. We won't spend much time on that because we don't do much of that here. But it's all about going from impure to pure vision through invoking deities like Tara, becoming Tara, syncing with Tara. So I just even mentioned that because in the weekend workshop, if you were here, Dale Borglum had already broached it. So I feel I wanted to just touch on that again. So all of this, okay, looked at the time, has to do with the provisional path. In addition to that, there's a definitive approach, which isn't an approach at all. It's an arrival. Not a gradual process of self-improvement, but an instantaneous process of recognition. So there's a whole other set now of pointing out instructions, and this is normally how that phrase is used. Maybe you've heard it. But rather than pointing out how the mind works, it's pointing out the nature of that mind, which does not change, does not exist in time. It can't be reached. So whereas on the front end, there's something to do, when we have a moment of instantaneous presence, there's nothing to do. In fact, that is the path. Non-action, non-doing. And the practice then is very different Because then it becomes one of tolerating undefended presence, non-reactive mind. And so this retreat that we're going to do at Big Springs in August is going to focus on that. Skillful means accessing and more ably tolerating naked awareness, undefended presence, spacious, uh, spacious wakefulness. Samyak view. So at this point, we're talking about right view as it is, non-dualistic, uncontrived, effortless. And so we're talking about specifically for me, Dzogchen. Also, this is true for like Advaita Vedanta, and to some extent for Mahamudra as well. So there's that. And so in a moment of openness, radical presence, simple, so simple, totally simple, in fact, then the challenge is one of relaxing. And it's so odd that it's difficult for us to accept it, but it is. So then we can be in a moment of total presence. Bodhi mind, in touch, the leaves are rustling. You're at one with things, right? It just happens. And then it changes. And so this is where in the two truths of the Mahayana, and it continues above that walk with two legs, relative and absolute. So relative, when we need to, when we're caught, when we're distracted, and then when we're not distracted, then there's another way to go about practice, we could say, but it's really nothing to practice. It is the actuality, samyak, total, complete, nothing left out, all inclusive vision, perfect view. And then there's perfect intention and perfect effort, and everything is au naturel. And so it's helpful, I found, to know what that is, have a glimpse, and then to kind of get clear that there's tranquil states, but it's not lucid state. All there's distinctions to be made, and Dzogchen makes these distinctions. They come up in practice. So when we're in a state of being at one, know how to continue in that. And then when we're not, to not pretend we are. And to be honest about where we are. And so then work on ourselves in the usual way. Shamatha Vipassana. So there's the basic Vipassana, as you know, and as I mentioned, where we do self-examination, self-observation, self-inquiry, inquiry into these various things like impermanence. And then there's Samya Vipassana. Those words I'm putting together. It's said a little differently in Dzogchen, but it's the same thing, but in a different octave. So that's more what I plan to say. So what do you think? How's it sit?
Can I pass the microphone first so that way people on Zoom can hear? Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and just so you guys know, Carol has a question on Zoom.
Okay. Go to Carol next.
Yeah, so this might be a little bit sideways, but um, I like that earlier example of how you can suddenly get startled. So someone behind me might say, "Hey, you." They might not be talking to me, but I'll feel myself sort of like, and that's sort of a bodily thing. I'm not thinking about that. There's a lot of reactions which I guess maybe psychology would call subconscious, right? And or moods or things that aren't directly thinking right in the moment, but like conditioned in there on a real primal, non-intellectual level. And it seems that I've seen people who, like you said earlier, are kind of conditionally they're okay and even very advanced sometimes, and other times in sort of just this kind of subconscious stuff, which seems like it's much harder to move or change. And it almost seems like necessarily you can't work on it directly. But I've seen people like for whom it hardly seems to change at all. Whereas other parts of their being, they'll notice I'm being reactive. I can, stop. Or I'm starting to think and freak out about politics. I'll stop. But these other things, which are more wired in there, I'm sort of asking, I guess, yeah, how does either the more gradual path or direct, does it address that directly, or is that something that's sort of hopefully as part of the process get indirectly purified through practice? And I hope that was clear because it's difficult to sort of elucidate the
Now,
difference.
there's a couple ways to go with this. Both both are useful. Dzogchen is faster if you can allow it. If you can't, then as usual, the Buddha Dharma is now we're 26 centuries on here. It's been working. In Tibet, there's very many, many, many um, experiences, stories of people becoming highly realized, super realized over centuries. Yeah, works. But even if it only works part way, and I'd be satisfied with that myself, like to reach the end, Theravada style, where you go into the Arya Magga, right? You stream winning, and then you go and go, and then you non-returning to be Arhat. You're beyond suffering. You're not coming back to samsara. So the thing about samsara, we think samsara is like a place, and nirvana is like another place, like heaven. That's not it. Samsara isn't a place. Samsara is what we're doing. It's our actions, karmic. It's karmic vision. And so to stop the negative solidifying process, you can then not return to samsara. That's an arhat, doesn't return to samsara, but they're not fully enlightened. They're not, and this is talked about both in Theravada literature and also in Mahayana literature. The arhat still has work to do, but they get to do that in a dharma realm. They're not yet a bodhisattva. They continue to practice and they become bodhisattva. And then they continue to practice, they become a mahasattva. They continue to practice and they become a Buddha. So the path just keeps going. So we work having the humility to know when you're triggered. This is why I'm emphasizing. I feel I have to do it. I've learned that I'm susceptible to inflation. And the more your practice works, and the more you're generous in like content like that, then you can also share Dharma by teaching. It's a real danger because then people admire you. Huge trap. For, say it again. For the
Maybe
ego.
give him the mic.
Yes, for the ego. Marie said, just yes, for the ego. So you can believe it. And okay, when you're believing it, now you've fallen out of pure vision. Because there's something to believe or disbelieve. But this thing about also somebody coming up behind you, practicing from more of like a Dzogchen style, there'll be a very quick moment, a split second, where there'll be a sound behind you, and your mind will clear. There'll be nothing there, and then sometimes very quickly, then you might go yikes. But before the yikes, there's a boom. That's a very fertile space, because you're very close now to emptiness. You're not in it maybe, but you're very close. And if you can relax, then dropping into openness. There's a word for that in Tibetan, hedawa. Hedawa is like a sharp sound, something like that. And there's a moment before we know what it is. There's a moment we don't know, and that not knowing is a fertile space. If we're hip and we don't go figuring it out, we don't usually lurch into figuring out, what was it? We could do that, but also we could, and then just slip into lucid openness. And the bliss starts arising. The natural mind is bliss saturated. So there becomes an incentive. We're not figuring it out right away. We're going to figure it out. We're in the material world. Carol.
So this is sort of a little twist on what you're now talking about. You said how to unfreeze our view so we can play with what's coming in. And it occurred to me that would increase my sense of humor. I wouldn't be so solid. I could play. I like the word play with what's coming in. And you also said a little bit about being more fluid. And then I thought, well, I would have to feel safe to be able to have more humor, more play. Maybe I don't feel safe enough to be humorous. So that's, maybe talk a little bit about that for me.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's about thawing. It's about thawing out. We say we can use purifying, we can use clarifying, we could also say thawing, warming up, right? Melting, and safe. Oh boy. No, it's never going to be safe for the ego. There's always going to be something out there, and we're going to either like it or dislike it. So, and here, Carol, is where the Lojong and Tonglen come in as very strong, skillful means to breathe in the insecurity, warm up to the scary, unsafe feeling, rather than keep the difficult stuff, whatever it is, my rage or my judgmental or my fear out there. Keep the negative things away and go to the positive. We want to breathe in the negative. So this is where this Mahayana class practice is more difficult. We don't go for safety. We breathe in the danger. We warm up to the danger. This is why it's a tougher practice, and why we have to begin, or it's helpful to begin, with a base in safety, in the ability to calm down and to befriend ourselves. Without that, it's really hard to do Tonglen. But with that, it's not so hard. But then we're not splitting the good from the bad so much. We're letting the bad in. Because in the getting our basic foundation, we're really splitting ourselves, aren't we? There's the good stuff we want to cultivate, and there's the bad stuff that's too hot to handle. Right? So if you're a monk or a nun, it's like you don't like touch money, it's too tempting, or sex. Oh, that's way too evocative. So let's just not do it. But when we move beyond that, no, let's relate to it. Let's relate to all of our being, our aggression, our kindness, our sexuality, our dullness, our lucidness, all of it. And so this is where not being safe is very good for Tonglen, because that's grist for the mill. That's, we feel unsafe, breathe in. If we happen to feel safe, fabulous, breathe that out. May everybody feel safe like I do right now. Content and secure and at peace with themselves. We breathe that out for others. And so this is what we've learned through that affinity group. We studied it, that as we breathe out for others, we're strengthening our own capacity because we're breathing it. For our potentiality is being exercised. So we say on this level, it's not about us getting enlightened, about us getting to nirvana. We begin like that because we've got to work with ourselves and we want to get somewhere. But if we go to bodhisattva level, now it's like, no, I won't go, you go for me. I'll wait, you go for it. That kind of a sacrifice strengthens our compassion and our ability to tolerate difficult situations. So this is why it's considered faster. And then with the Vajrayana or Dzogchen is faster still, if it's legit and not a fantasy. We have time for one more question in the room
I'm going
here.
to pass the mic. You start with your name and hold it close.
I'm Mark. Would you say our neurotic tendencies and patterns are rooted in our muscles and our tensions?
I didn't even recognize you, Mark.
Yeah, hi.
You have more hair on your face.
I've known Ken for many years, and I've seen the aggression soften, and it's a real tribute to your work.
Okay, ask your question again.
Is our neurotic splits anchored in our muscular tensions in our body?
Well,
Would
what
you
do you
say?
what do you say? What do you think?
I suspect they are, and I suspect my body will change as I hope anyway.
Yeah, the way you ask the question kind of gives it away that you know the answer.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we're not divided. You know, it's not a separate mind, a separate body. This is a Western, this separation of self and world, inside, outside, mind and body, this disease that has catapulted our technological development. So it's not all bad, right? It's good and bad, like so many gifts, like so many plagues. The mind and body are not separate, and there's a link between them. So it's common in Western medicine now to talk about mind body, but between mind and body, there's energy, subtle body, emotional body. And in the East, in Tibetan medicine, I suspect in Chinese too, and maybe Ayurveda as well, there's a lot of emphasis on the subtle body, on the flow of prana, of chi. And in psychology, Rick and I practice psychology together. I came to this conclusion that it's not really so much about the mind. It's about the energy, emotional fixations, emotional snags. So that's where the deeper psychotherapy just like deeper meditation practice, we drop her down. It's not just, first we might have to do analysis to kind of like get our footing, get our grip, kind of get some confidence that we can do this thing life, this thing my life. There's a way of doing it more skillfully, more meditatively, less reactively. So we do this, calm it down, look inside, and then we begin to say, okay, now I have a little more space, not so reactive. I got it. Okay, but then it needs to go down. Because we'll be haunted by our unlived life, our undigested life, a part of ourselves that we've pushed away. It wants to come back. And this is a thing that's really hard to talk about. How there is a force inside us that seeks wholeness, a thrust toward authenticity, toward awakening, enlightened intent. This doesn't appear except in Dzogchen Tantras, as far as I know. It's like too charged, because otherwise we could reify that. It's not us doing it. This is where giving ourselves over to presence, being, going from self-centeredness, then through belly-centeredness to being rootedness, re-rooting ourselves from our mind and the tensions in our body into this thing that's holding it all and always has. We think that we exist. This is how we think. We exist. Before we didn't. It was non-existence. And then we were born, and now we exist. And then later, we're going to die and not exist again. That time-based idea, thought, recognition, we don't see is held within a larger manner of being in which existence and non-existence cycle. They're not different. Emptiness is form. Form is emptiness. Existence doesn't exist. Non-existence exists. Feeling is empty, non-existence. Non-existence feels, thinks, senses. This really mind-blowing, divine paradox cannot be understood. It can, however, be recognized, intuited. So this is where, when you feel you're up for it, go into a more formless style that's more definitively keyed, this essence keyed, will be helpful to you. But you need to be interested. If you're not interested, don't worry about it. Just do your thing. Purify bit by bit. Get ready. Get better. Get ready. Get ready. Be a better person. Be happy about yourself when you look into the mirror. Yeah. Right? It was a good day. I let somebody, cut in front of me in traffic. Hey, whatever. I did, I like me. This is very, very important. Very dualistic, but that's fine. Because we need to have that base. And then when we have feeling like, okay, well, now I'm interested in this more direct thing. Even if we still, are suspicious of ourselves and don't like ourselves in certain ways, but we're still like really interested. That's the only requirement. If you're interested, follow your interest. If you're not, don't bother. Managed to go beyond time again. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for your presence, for your attention, and for all of us here in the room and online. May the merit we've generated here tonight clarify our mind streams and be of benefit to all beings. May all beings be happy and nourish the causes of happiness. May we be free of suffering and its causes. May we never be parted from happiness, free from sorrow. May all beings be free of grasping, hatred, fear, indifference, jealousy, and arrogance, and remain in great equanimity, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and heartfelt compassion. May all beings everywhere be free.